Hello and welcome to the MBOM podcast, where you will learn to master the business of yoga with guests from around the world who have experienced becoming successful yoga teachers, studio owners, and much more. Now, here's your host, Amanda Kingsmith.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the MBM podcast. On this week's episode, I'm going to be answering your questions. So it's a little Q&A episode, and there's not a ton of questions, but there's a couple that have been sent in to me, and I thought that it would just be cool to answer them live on the air, and then everyone can receive the answers, because usually my philosophy is that if one person has a question, a bunch of other people do probably have a question as well. So for future reference, if anyone does have a question, you can send me an email at info@mbomyoga.com. And I would love to hear from you. I might not be able to answer your question, but if you have a question, you might as well reach out. I've got lots of contacts in the yoga world, so I'll obviously try and do my best to provide you with the resources that you need. So without further ado, let's begin. All right. So question number one is about once you've been teaching for a while and you're teaching a bunch of classes in a week, how do you keep things creative? So you're teaching at maybe a couple studios and you tend to teach the same things, and you're worried that people might come to your classes and be like, oh, well, we did this yesterday, or we did this on Monday, or we did this last week. Yet there's only so much that you can draw from as a yoga teacher, because you have sort of what you like to teach and your sort of style and that sort of thing. So how do you keep things creative? How do you mix things up? And the answer that I would give for this is to go to other teachers' classes, gather inspiration from people that you really like to practice with. So if you tend to teach the same poses in the same order and you feel like they flow really well, there's nothing wrong with that. But maybe you go to somebody else's classes and you see like, oh, right, that pose, I never teach that back bend, or I never teach that version of that forward fold. And things that feel really good in their bodies might not be the things that you're naturally drawn to in your self-practice or when you put together your sequences. So I feel like going to other teachers' classes is a really great way to see how other teachers are sequencing and to get inspiration from other people. And it's kind of just this, it's almost like hitting the reset button. Like if you spend a week going to a bunch of different teachers' classes, you're like, okay, yes, like I feel fresh, I feel renewed, I feel ready to take on, my next week worth of classes, and I've got new, fresh ideas. So if you're at home being like, yes, exactly, I've been teaching 10 to 20 classes a week and I feel like things are getting kind of old and boring, try out a different teacher's classes, go to teachers that you really like, go to a new studio, just find inspiration from the outside, because if you're always drawing from within yourself, that's amazing, but you might tend to go towards the same poses, as I said before. And so hopefully that answers that question. I guess, so a second part to that question is if you're feeling really stagnant, like you're like, yep, I already go to other people's classes, perhaps even going outside of that and maybe looking into weekend-long teacher trainings where you can learn something different. Like maybe you go learn adjustments from somebody else, or maybe you go to like an Ashtanga workshop because you don't usually do that. Or even looking into like further teacher training, like another 200 hour, maybe a 300 hour. So if you're feeling like you're really stagnant and really burnt out, then maybe it's going beyond just other teachers' classes and it's really going towards like, okay, I really need to learn something fresh and something new. So that's also another alternative to that. So thanks for that question, and hopefully that answers that. Another question that I received, so question number 2, is on website hosting. So in the episode with Yohai Weiss, we talked about creating a website and how a website can be really important. And this is something that's come up as a top business lesson time and time again on the podcast, is like, if you want to be successful, you should probably have your own brand, buy your domain name as your website. So have, amandakingsmith.com as something that people can go to. And then from there have like a landing page or something where people can see your schedule, see what you're all about. And this is often easier said than done, but once you're kind of in it, it actually isn't that hard. So in terms of the site that I would use, I would always tend to recommend WordPress. I feel like WordPress is just really intuitive. There's a lot of YouTube videos out there on how to use it. And I think it's a lot more intuitive and just better than a lot of the other websites out there. So I would say do WordPress. And then if you don't want to have a .blogspot or a .wordpress website, if you want to just be like amandakingsmith.com, you actually have to have a host. And so I host all of the websites that I'm a part of through Bluehost. And so it's just www.bluehost.com. And of course, I'll put that on the show notes at www.mbmyoga.com. But Bluehost is really good. They usually have good deals. It's only a couple bucks a month to host your website for a year. And that way you just own your domain name. So when you say hosting, it means that you actually own that domain name. So it belongs to you and you're not just borrowing it from whatever your blog or your website's built off of, like WordPress. And so WordPress and Bluehost would be my top two. Obviously, there's lots of other places that you can go to get those things. It's just what I've used. It's what I was referred to using, and I've never had any problems with them. Even if I've had an issue with something with WordPress or Bluehost, both of them have really good customer service, and they're really good about helping you with anything that you need. And like I said before, there's tons of YouTube videos on how to use WordPress, how to set up your theme, how to set up everything. And I find that the back end of it is just super intuitive. Like when I started using it, I was like, sweet, posting blogs is not actually that hard, which is kind of awesome because if you're not a tech person, it can be really confusing. And if anyone has any further questions about that, feel free to reach out, of course, and I can answer more specifically. Going into question number 3, how many classes per week should I be teaching to be full-time? And this is kind of an interesting question that doesn't really have a strict answer. Karen Christensen and I talked about this on her episode. We were talking about how it's kind of different for every person. So it's something that you sort of need to feel out for yourself as a yoga teacher. Somebody can't really tell you like, yes, you need to teach 12 classes per week in order to keep your energy up, in order not to get sick, in order not to get injured, in order to keep your personal practice, in order to teach at your best. It's not really the case. Everyone's sort of different. And I think that the best way to do that is to sort of dive in as a teacher. If you already have a full-time job and you want to teach on the side, or you think you want to transition to full-time, I think the best way to go is to keep your full-time job, find some studios that you can start subbing with or find some regular classes with, and just start teaching. Just start getting a feel for, how many classes can I do? And it was really interesting talking to Karen because she's a pretty high energy, extroverted person. You see that in her day-to-day life and her bubbly personality, but it also comes across in her teaching style. And for her, 17 to 20 classes is totally fine. Like she's not burnt out like that full time. Whereas I talked to Katie Roll, who's somebody who also I met in Atlanta, and she teaches at one of the same studios as Karen. And she was talking about how, 11 is like quite a bit for her, and she gets pretty run down if she teaches many more than that. And I think that it's just seeing where you tend towards. I know for me, sort of around the 5 to 10 mark is pretty good for me. Over 5 is like over 10, is very overwhelming for me. And it's just a lot. I feel like I need to come home and just sort of like lie in my bed and like recharge my batteries. And so it just depends who you are and what you're looking for. And another thing to consider too is what else are you doing? And I think that that's been a big thing for me is that while teaching, I've always been doing other things. So to teach more than 10 classes while, working for a yoga studio and hosting 2 podcasts is just too much because I'm busy constantly and it takes away the time that I need for my personal practice. So what I would suggest is sitting down and sort of looking at your life, maybe writing out all the different things that you've got going on, and then looking at how much time each of those takes in a week, and then looking at what money you're getting back from each of them. So what do you need financially to stay afloat versus what are you actually getting back from all these different gigs that you're doing or from your full-time job? And then looking at, if I was to leave my full-time job, how many classes a week would I need to be teaching in order to break even with what I need? And when I look at that number, does that seem like something that's feasible for me? And then going from there. And so there's really no right or wrong. For you, it might be 1 class, it might be 2 classes and keeping a corporate job, or it might be 5 to 10 with a part-time job on the side, or it might be 10 to 15 classes and just doing that full time. And so just looking at your life, looking at your finances, your current situation, everyone's different in terms of what they need, their financial stability, what they're looking to get out of their career. And then also considering things like which area of the teaching are you looking to do? Are you looking to become a studio owner and you need to save money in order to do that? Are you looking to go more towards teaching private yoga? Are you looking towards running workshops at least once a month and having money coming in from that? And then thinking about that as well, because there's so many other elements that can work together with just teaching your regular weekly classes. And also considering how many studios you're going to be teaching at and how far they are, because it's easy to be like, okay, yeah, I teach for an hour. So if I teach 10 classes a week, I only teach 10 hours, but you know how much prep time goes into that, how much self-practice you need to do to feel ready for that class. How long does it take to get to the studio? And then, you know, ultimately, how much are you making from that then? Because if 3 hours goes into it and you make $20 a class, maybe it's not really going to work for you to continue teaching there, to be teaching that class. And so just a lot of different factors play in with that. So there is no real answer that I can give for that question. It's really looking at your own life and seeing what's going to work for you and knowing that that's not set in stone either and that might change a lot. And so if you have any other questions sort of surrounding that, definitely reach out. It's sort of a broad answer to sort of a broad topic, and it's probably something that could even be an entire episode. But so for now, I'll cap that answer there and move on to the next question. All right. So question number 4 is about yoga teacher training. And this is another really big question, is how do I find the right yoga teacher training for me? And Chelsea Orth and I talked about this in episode 2. I met Chelsea at my yoga teacher training, and I just had to ask her, you know, how did we end up at the same teacher training in the same month? You know, this place runs teacher trainings basically every single month. And, you know, there's thousands of teacher training programs in the world now. And finding a teacher training can be really overwhelming. I think it was one of the things that overwhelmed me the most about the entire process. But so there's a couple steps with it. First of all, deciding where you want to do it. So do you want to do it in your hometown? Is there a city nearby? Do you want to go traveling with it? And if so, where do you want to go? Deciding a price range, because there can be sort of a range of different prices. Another thing to consider is if there's a specific teacher you want to do it with. So, Erin Evans runs teacher training. She was on the podcast early on in this season, and she runs a teacher training that has been quite sought after by a lot of people who are in sort of the Banff, Canmore, Alberta area. And I know I worked with a couple girls who were like, yes, I'm waiting to do this program. And so maybe that's you. Maybe there's a teacher you love and you're going to wait until they run a teacher training. You're going to wait a year for that, or you're going to wait however many months until the next one comes up. And so sort of deciding where you want to go, how much you want to spend, if there's a certain teacher you want to do it with. And if you're sort of like, there's no teacher, I've got a broad price range and I'm happy to go anywhere in the world. Something that I actually found to be really helpful was bookyogaretreats.com, which sounds kind of, I guess, silly because it's called Book Yoga Retreats, but there's actually yoga teacher training programs on there. And you can set different filters based on different locations, or you could just set to like 200-hour teacher training and look at all the different ones that are running sort of in select locations around the world. And something that's really cool about that is that you've got actual reviews. So when you're going to pick a program and you're like, yes, I'm spending, $2,000 to $3,000 on this, you kind of want to know that it's amazing, which is not always easy when you've never heard anything about it before. And so I think that that's a really good place to start if you're really, really uncertain about the other things that I sort of mentioned. And from there, maybe you can narrow it down. And I think that something else I would always consider would be word of mouth. Ask the people you know who teach yoga. Ask the teachers that you go to their classes, because they can probably give you some ideas as to a bunch of different programs that are offered out there in various different locations. And then another thing to consider is how long of a program you want to do, because I've met people who've done it over 9 months. I've met people who've done it over 4 months. And then there's people like myself who did it in 30 days. And each different teacher training is going to provide pros and cons. For me, it ultimately came down to wanting to take a vacation, wanting to go away to do it, not working while I did it. And for me, that meant a 30-day one. So looking at those different areas in your life and what you're looking to get out of it, also looking if there's a specific style you want to do. So if you want to teach hatha, if you want to teach vinyasa, if you're looking to go more of the like yin restorative route, or if you're looking to do an Ashtanga based teacher training. And so there's lots of different options out there for each different thing. So really sitting down and sort of making a list of your criteria. And I think that once you do that, you'll find that there'll be something that sticks out to you a little bit more. And then something I also mentioned on the solo episode I did about who should do a yoga teacher training program. Answer, everyone, or anyone who wants to rather. Something to look at is also if there's a skill level requirement and looking at where you're at with your teacher training, because I think that that's something that always or often seems to intimidate people is, I want to be a yoga teacher, but I just don't know if this is right for me or not. So definitely something to consider when you're picking a program. And once again, if you have any more specific questions about that, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm going to leave it there with that one. And question number 5 is a really interesting question. It's about wanting to teach sort of outside of your hometown or your home studio and how to go about doing that. And this is something that I talked about with the Yoga Nomads on their episode, because they're traveling yoga teachers. And a really great resource for that is Yoga Trade. So go on to Yoga Trade. You have to sign up in order to get the details. It's only $25 a year though. And I think it's totally worth it because they send out, it's either weekly or monthly emails, and it just shows you all the places in the world where they're looking for yoga teachers. And there's a lot of cool stuff on there. So if you are looking to get a job somewhere that's not where you currently are located, this is a really great way to sort of travel and do yoga. And it's also a really interesting way to get experience, especially if you are a newer teacher. And that would be my biggest recommendation for people who are looking to get a job is you need to start teaching, and you need to start teaching regularly, get your words together, get your cues, be comfortable with your sequences. And the only way that that's going to get better and more comfortable is by practicing. And super cool to be able to travel and get a job. So definitely check out Yoga Trade. They even have stuff in and around North America. So if you're not looking to, say teach yoga in the Dominican Republic, for example, you can find a job that's maybe in like California or something that's a little bit closer to where you're located. So hopefully that answers that question. And so one final question before we wrap up this episode of the podcast is about whether or not you should be putting together sequences before your classes and how much you should be preparing. And this is a really interesting question because I've talked to quite a few people on this podcast in my day-to-day life to see what they do. And some people after, 15, 20 years of teaching still prepare their sequences, and other people right from their very first class don't prepare their sequences. So this seems to be a really preferable thing. I think it really depends on your teaching style, your learning style, how you operate in front of people. I know for me, I like to usually get an idea of what I want to teach. So I'll have sort of a structure. It's like, okay, how much time do we have for prep poses? How many prep poses will be sort of appropriate for this audience? Am I going to do sun salutations? Are they going to be modified? How many standing sequences are we going to do? How much floor work are we going to do? What types of things might we work on the floor in terms of back bends or inversions? And sometimes you can show up to a class and be completely wrong about that sort of thing. And I think that that's the time where you sort of need to be like, okay, I'm not completely attached to this sequence. And I've showed up to classes where I've actually showed up to a class where I wasn't actually even teaching the style that I thought I was teaching. I was teaching more of a mix between flow, vinyasa flow, and yin, as opposed to just like a strict power class. And that kind of like, I had a moment where I was like, oh my gosh, but I know what I was teaching for the power class. And then I was like, whatever, you've got it. And so that's a huge thing, is trusting yourself, trusting that, if you practice at home, if you practice in studio, if you have some teaching experience, that you're going to be okay because you've got these things kind of like in your brain for when you need them. I think that in terms of teaching a first class, I would definitely prepare. I know that for me, I put together a sequence that I wanted to do, and then I practiced it, and I practiced talking out loud, because the most awkward thing you'll realize as you teach more is you've done, say pigeon pose a million times, and you go to teach it and you're like, I actually don't know how to cue effectively to get a person into this pose. And so that's where I think that just finding your words makes it easier over time. But in terms of preparation, I think that it's important to think about your class, think about, who might be at that class, think about the level of the class and what poses might be appropriate for them, and get a good idea. If you're feeling really nervous, I think definitely making a sequence and sticking to it for the first couple months that you're teaching is definitely okay. Just make sure that the class is about your students and it's not just about you, because it's really not about you. It is about your students. So just make sure you're teaching that way would be my biggest piece of advice. And if you have any other questions about sequencing, strategic sequencing for bodies, or different ways of putting together sequences, definitely shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer that. I really love the whole putting together sequences and trying out different things and seeing if they flow. And that's another thing. Sometimes if I teach something and it really doesn't work when I'm teaching it, sometimes I'll kind of ditch it. I'll let it go. I'll be like, okay, that sequence didn't really work together. So I'll try those poses in a different order with different other poses together to see if that feels a little bit better in my body and my students' bodies. And so just learning as you go from your students. All right, so that's all the questions that I have. If anyone has any questions that come up from this episode or anything that they would like to have answered or they'd like to hear about, definitely shoot me an email. Once again, it's info@mbomyoga.com. And I would love to hear from you if you just want to say hi, or you've got a comment or some feedback. And if you enjoy the podcast, definitely join the community on Facebook at facebook.com/masteringthebusinessofyoga/. And as always, thanks so much for listening.